At last! I can talk about my thesis and the entire purpose of this project, and it only took an hour and 56 minutes, and then some, to get here. There's still so much to do it right. Jesus fucking Christ. To adequately piece together the ways Omegaverse adapts to cultural boundaries, we gotta give the context to those adaptations as they happen along cultural boundaries. We gotta talk about the context of Omegaverse as boys love media following its origin point of slash fiction, who the audience is for BL and slash are, why they like BL and slash, and then we'll talk about how Omegaverse slots into BL and why people like Omegaverse BL, and all of that is to explain Omegaverse as a subgenre of BL, which then allows us to talk about Omegaverse as it is presented through different East Asian lenses, primarily using BL, but also using GL and Josei. Context, darlings. It is all about the context. We are 15,600 words deep in nothing but fucking context. Let's go! Speculative fiction is an umbrella term for genres with elements that do not exist in reality, recorded history, nature, or the present universe. The overarching categories speculative fiction genres fall into are horror, alternate history, fantasy, and science fiction. Speculative fiction includes these genres, combinations of these genres, their subgenres, and combinations of those genres, and combinations of genres and subgenres. Omegaverse is a subgenre of speculative erotic fiction. This can be interpreted two ways: speculative fiction genre, erotic subgenre, or erotic genre, speculative fiction subgenre. As we talk about how Omegaverse looks between manga, webtoons, and manhwa and why they look that way, we'll come back to how understanding of these interpretations is shown in comics. Understanding why Omegaverse looks different in these mediums means considering the relationships between those mediums and thereby the relationships between Japan, Korea, and China. The relationships suck! That's it. That's the history lesson. Not to grossly oversimplify, but the land making up these current nation states has been civilized for thousands of years by varying populations and warring for most of it. If you know anything about history, you probably know that the last century for them has also been not great in every direction. It has gotten better, but the bar for better is exceedingly low. On a good day, the relationships between China, Japan, and South Korea are tenuous. But it's not like cultural exchange never happened throughout their shared history. It always happened. In recent decades, cultural items crossed borders, with individuals bringing books, television shows, movies, music, and the like. Today's hesitant peace is brought about by trade interdependency. Japanese boys' love comics emerged in the 1970s on the back of young female mangaka creating amateur comics, doujinshi, and professional commercial variants of yaoi appeared in the late 1980s and 1990s. Korea's official ban on Japanese cultural imports ended in 1998 and allowed for an open-door policy to Japanese pop culture. A door set ajar after 1965 when Korea established diplomatic relations with Japan. And in spite of this ban on cultural imports, boys love doujinshi of the 1980s managed to inspire a Korean equivalent before the decade was out. So how did it end up in China when the ruling party actively refused the influence of its neighbors? Well, Taiwan was getting manga and anime from Japan in the 1970s, and at the time, Taiwan had censorship laws on nudity and violence, but as it turned out, that didn't really affect pirated Japanese BL content. Whack. The explosion of boys' love popularity and its penetration, into Chinese markets can be attributed to the technological revolution. The internet provided space for more interactions and interdependence among Chinese-speaking writers and readers, which resulted in more visibility of BL culture in the region. By the late 1990s, Hong Kong saw BL spreading to the city via Taiwan, and it became a bridgehead to BL's expansion into mainland China. While boys' love was gaining popularity in East Asia, slash fiction was developing in the Anglophone West contemporaneously with, but independently of, shonenai. They developed at the same time on opposite sides of the world without the influence of the other. This is an important thing to note because I love blaming
the global West
for things, for real and for memes. But alas, blaming
the global West
for the poor moral character of queerness is an old propaganda move from the mid-20th century spurned following World War II. The motivations that led to East Asian gay comics and gay fanfiction in America were different. BL comics grew from much-needed change in shoujo manga. Slash fiction grew from the premise of an intense sexual attraction between Kirk and Spock. This is an excellent time to cut back to where I said that characteristics of Omegaverse are shown in fiction at least as early as Pon farr in Star Trek. In Star Trek, Pon farr describes the Vulcan mating cycle, during which Vulcans must have sex or suffer excruciating pain, insanity, and potential death. This particular moment in the original Star Trek series became a basis of a host of Pon farr stories where Spock is slowly going insane, and Kirk is his only option. There was only one bed. There was only one knot. One of the earliest examinations of the historical through-line of the Pon farr trope to wolf nuts is the 2013 essay Pon farr, Mpreg, Bonds, and the Rise of Omegaverse by Dr. Christina Bussey, which I just cited 5 seconds ago. Dr. Bussey's work in fan studies, specifically Omegaverse, led her to being subpoenaed as an expert witness on the 2019 Omegaverse lawsuits, the ones Lindsay Ellis made videos on. Dr. Bussey's work on Omegaverse informs a number of sources that I've read and referenced. With the origins of Slash and BL having historical parallels in function, it checks out that there's an overlap in audience demographics. There seems to be a broad consensus about the characteristics of erotic fanfiction writers, such as that they are predominantly female and often relatively young. Many started writing fanfiction as teenagers. Among erotic fanfiction authors, LGBTIQ+ identified people are more visible than in the general population. About 1/3 of the readers has written fanfiction themselves. In Japan, survey data of random college-aged students showed that significantly more women than men knew about BL. Most BL mangaka are female, and it is popular wisdom that most female BL fans in Japan identify as heterosexual. In China, membership of danmei sites consists predominantly of urban, educated women aged between about 18 to 35. In one study, all respondents were female. Just over 3/4 identified as heterosexual, and just under 3/4 had started to read danmei before they were 19. In the Anglophone West, the majority of respondents in a set of BL yaoi fan studies were 18 to 24, significantly more women than men consumed BL, and there were relatively low numbers of fandom participants identifying as heterosexual, about half of women and a very small percentage of men. Apparently, erotic fanfiction authors combine 1. Their love of the source material, with 2. Their sexual desires, and 3. Their interest in writing. Writing in the Wild, Writers' Motivation and Fan-Based Affinity Spaces explores interest-driven writing while building on the concept of affinity spaces, where affinity spaces are places where people get together because of a shared strong interest or engagement in a common activity. Clubs, groups, fandoms, those things. The article follows 3 individual fans in 3 separate affinity spaces. Fan number 1 feels as though her reading and writing practices are interrelated, and that participating in online fandom has changed her understanding of source material. Fan number 2 values the instant feedback from sharing online. It's encouraging. She sees herself as part of an exchange on par with other writers, regardless of age. Fan number 3 tells stories through writing fanfiction, making banners, taking and editing photos, and combining these to create an involved, multimodal, transformative work. Supportive friends and fans motivate her to develop her skills and overcome her dyslexia. Fans 1, 2, and 3 aren't erotic fanfiction writers to the best of my knowledge, or mentioned as them in the piece, but the basics apply. These creators love the source material. They have desires to expand on the source material, and they're invested in the creative process. Dr. Drew Pagliasotti performed an English-language yaoi survey for the piece Reading Boys Love in the West, published in a special edition Participations journal in November 2008. Loving the Love of Boys, Motives for Consuming Yaoi Media is quantitative research exploring and operationalizing the motives for yaoi media consumption using Pagliasotti's survey results. The results of Pagliasotti's original study showed 10 distinct motive dimensions for consuming yaoi, BL, media. These diverse motivations for consuming yaoi may be complicated by cultural and legal differences between various countries that affect the context under which yaoi is consumed, so surveys of specific regions or demographics could produce different results. As examples, a study on Taiwanese yaoi readers found female readers are motivated to challenge social taboos, experience freedom from gender constraints, and enjoy incorporating traditional gender norms into homosexual love stories while reading or creating yaoi. A Swedish yaoi study found readers expressed an interest in yaoi materials for their portrayal of gender equality and their sexually arousing aspects. One on heterosexual male yaoi readers concluded that male viewers and readers wish to identify with feminized male characters in narratives that deconstruct the social paradigms of masculinity, thus gaining a deeper understanding of their own dilemmas relating to gender conventions. Quantitative analysis involves a lot of super interesting math that I am in no way qualified to explain. I'm barely qualified to read it. But if you want to see all the numbers, go look at the article. What we are going to use is part of the conclusion. The motive dimensions, representing a considerable proportion of variance in the present study, were arousing, sexually titillating, and art and aesthetics. This suggests that the most attractive features of BL media are their sexual content and aesthetic portrayal of characters and sexuality. I've wondered if it's necessary to talk about Slash as much as I have as it relates to BL, but you really can't separate Omegaverse from gay English fanfiction. My subject is East Asian Omegaverse comics. Did you forget? I didn't forget. I have to build a lot of bridges and a fat fuck foundation to make this work. Wait till you see what we're leading up to. There hasn't been a major study on the motivations for producing or consuming ABO media. Wonder why. But we can make an educated guess based on knowledge available to us. So combine the results of the BL motivation survey with the following. It's not what you would expect. How Omegaverse roleplayers engage with normative ideas of gender and sexuality is a thesis that explores Omegaverse roleplayers' engagement with normative ideas or structures of gender and sexuality in their role-playing. The author places motivations into 4 categories. Motive 1, play. Motive 2, pleasure. Motive 3, gender structure. And motive 4, therapy. These 4 motivations for role-playing Omegaverse intersect with the motives for consuming BL media. And 3 of these 4 motivations intersect with the 3 motivations for producing erotic fanfiction. We can infer that the reason people like Omegaverse, why Omegaverse has been able to cross cultural boundaries into different mediums and find homes around the world, is that it is necessarily inherently queer, and it is appealing, attractive. The proper academic position on this matter is that people like Omegaverse because it's hot gay shit. I promised you my thesis, and I did not lie to you. I just happened to need to prove, academically, that people like Omegaverse because it's hot gay shit. What am I doing? Okay, getting back on my Anglo-centric bullshit one more time. One more, that's it, for some big bad context of the I've purposely neglected until now because it needs to be handled in the context of cultural framing. Hierarchies present in Omegaverse fiction are not unique to Omegaverse fiction. The real-world hierarchies they emulate and critique are not unique to the United States of America. But before I explain why it looks different in other countries, I'd like to make a case for Omegaverse's origins and the way it views things being uniquely American. Are you ready for this? Hang on. Take a sip of water. Omegaverse fiction is a late-stage product of colonialism. Technically everything in America is the way it is because of colonialism. You know, not really the point here. During the Middle Ages, there was a war on wolves where belief in witches and lycanthropes evolved side by side and resulted in the persecution of witches and werewolves. The persecution of wolves and suspected werewolves was exacerbated by the agricultural revolution because wolves attacked dumb livestock and dumb people, therefore, wolves bad. To say North America fucked wolves over by also persecuting wolves that came after dumb livestock and dumb people would be reductive and misrepresentative of history. Because the persecution of wolves wasn't the fault of North Americans, it was the fault of colonizers. The war on wolves started in Europe. Before colonization, everything above 20 degrees north latitude in North America was inhabited by wolves. There were hundreds of thousands of wolves across the diverse environments. Native American spiritual practices were diverse across nations, tribes, and bands with unique ceremonies and celebrations. One commonality many Native American beliefs held was a spiritual connection to nature. Indigenous people shared their land with its inhabitants. For tribes that shared their land with wolves, there was often a spiritual bond between people and the wolves that lived with them. Wolves could hunt alongside them. They were companions. Some tribes saw them as gods taking physical form, as mentors and guides. Wolves were respected and revered. Colonizers, however, tried converting Native Americans to Christianity, Catholicism, or Protestantism. No, it was usually Protestantism. Protestantism was a real problem from the beginning of their little excursion to quote-unquote uncivilized land. The beliefs natives held were viewed as barbaric, and a non-zero amount of native practices looked an awful lot like witchcraft to uneducated, self-important Protestant colonialists. Their treatment of natives was no better than their treatment of wild animals. The witches and wolves plaguing North America for the colonizers that were destined to take the land created a problem for them. Problems for the colonizers' own fragile culture and beliefs. Problems for the colonizers' farming practices. Atop this, colonizers enjoyed hunting for sport and profit alike, killing animals that indigenous people cohabited with and leaving their carcasses to rot, selling all their bones and pelts and whatnot. They did this, of course, without care for the indigenous people or native animal populations. Fuck them and fuck their wolves, as it were. And somehow eventually became, fuck wolves and fuck wolf, like, whatever. American history is pitched and taught in the US as a grand mythos of religious people seeking freedom from oppression, which is not at all how it went down. The Protestants were kicked out of England for being fucking crazy. The US is basically religious prison colony the way that Australia was prisoner prison colony. And now look at us. Denying this reality has had horrific consequences. It's not a coincidence that Protestants ended up doing the same shit to Native Americans that their lords in Europe had already done to them, but worse because they were in fact worse than other Christians. And also, genocide. The hierarchies of yield Europe are ingrained in America's culture and government to this day, but textbooks claim the relationship between colonizers and a population they genocided is a positive one, as if the histories, legends, and cultural artifacts of indigenous people weren't killed along with them. Enter the TV show Supernatural, our source material that inspired the Omegaverse genre. Supernatural's creator once described Supernatural as a modern American Western. Sam and Dean are named in homage to Sal and Dean from the book On the Road. They're from Kansas, which apparently exists, I say, from another state that doesn't matter. They share a 1967 Chevy Impala. Those things feel like all-American cultural signifiers. But the real Americana of Supernatural is in the American myths, legends, and folk tales that were the creator's initial inspiration for Supernatural. The show has direct references to colonial history and indigenous legends. The pilot episode features the spirit of La Llorona. In some Central and South American places, La Llorona is known as the vengeful ghost of an indigenous woman who drowned her children in a fit of insanity after the Spanish conquistador who impregnated her abandoned her. This story is older than the Hispanic populations of North and Central America. Today it's told in Mexico and Central America and is known along the border of the US with Mexico. The show's second episode is about a Wendigo, a creature from First Nations, Great Plains, and Great Lakes mythology. Original portrayals of the Wendigo were of a giant humanoid creature with a heart made of ice that carried a perpetual chill around it, and smelled like shit. After colonization, the common portrayal of the Wendigo became that which we know, which is that of a creature cursed with insatiable desire to cannibalize humans. In another episode, Pestilence, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, gave the world swine flu so that a virus called the Croatoan virus could be spread globally via vaccine. This is a reference to the lost colony of Roanoke Island, North Carolina, an English colony settled in 1585 where over 100 settlers straight up vanished. In 1590, relief explorers found the colony deserted with no hints to the disappearance other than the word Croatoan carved into fencing near the colony's entrance. Croatoan D's nuts. Boom! Got him! The show also references myths that are considered American because they came to North America with Europeans. In the show, Bloody Mary is a malevolent spirit that can be summoned from mirrors within the vicinity of the mirror she died near by saying Bloody Mary 3 times, like in the urban legend. In reality, there are multiple women who Bloody Mary is suspected to represent. One of them is Queen Mary I, or Mary Tudor of England, who during her reign had over 300 Protestants executed in accordance with then Catholic England's heresy laws, around 280 of which were burned at the stake. She was known to Protestants as Bloody Mary. Another potential Mary is Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess who, according to legends, killed hundreds of girls with the help of her servants, then bathed in the blood of virgins she killed so she could stay young forever. She is also the inspiration for the tale of the vampiress Carmilla. There's an episode about a wishing well in which anyone can make a wish, but the wish can only be reversed by the wisher retrieving their coin from the bottom of the well. And wishing wells appear in multiple branches of European folklore, though I'd particularly look at Celtic stuff for this. There are many episodes of Supernatural featuring werewolves. Legends of werewolves as presented in the show are based on European lycanthropes, with the concepts of full moon transformations being referenced as far back as ancient Greek texts. Native American legends have shapeshifters and skinwalkers, but shapeshifters and skinwalkers didn't specialize in taking wolf forms or using animal forms to kill people and livestock. Wolf paranoia, as it pertained to lycanthropy, was uniquely European. When colonists brought that paranoia to North America and used it as added justification to kill wolves and humans indiscriminately, those executions became uniquely colonial, and thereby uniquely American. Those executions are a disc in the spine that props up this country's skeleton. I didn't watch much of Supernatural myself, so I can't say whether or not the show outright ever stated colonialism bad, but the portrayal of these cultural artifacts show the creators' understandings of those stories, so I would make a guess. The legend of La Llorona is obviously a tragedy. La Llorona is evil. She whose madness came at the hands of a colonizer is evidence that what the conquistador did to the indigenous woman was bad. Historically, the Wendigo evolving from a monster to a man who became a monster kinda gentrifies the Wendigo and the meaning it held to natives by making the Wendigo about cannibalism, greed, and savagery. Barbarism. The Wendigo in either case is portrayed as bad. Bloody Mary, whose hands were stained whether she was Mary I, Elizabeth Bathory, or any of the other potential Marys, is portrayed as a malevolent spirit because what she did, supposedly, was bad. I will add that the Protestants during the era of the Reformation were, in fact, batshit crazy. Their reason for starting their Protestant Reformation movement, as far as the abuses and collusion, corruption within the Catholic Church, that was reasonable during the time of Queen Mary Tudor I, in addition to burning Protestants alive. A number of them fled to exile to escape because they were all considered criminals under Catholic England's heresy laws, which was interesting because Queen Mary I also didn't have a law saying you couldn't practice a religion other than hers. You did not have to be Queen Mary I's religion under her rule. However, the Protestants fucked around and found out, man. If you'd like a good channel where you can learn more about the effects of Protestantism long-term, how it affects quote-unquote Western society, which isn't nearly specific enough, how it influences us in our daily lives today, I would recommend the channel Renegade Cut. The dude makes great video essays, a lot of which are about the impact of religion and religious values on politics in America. Werewolves, which are common monsters that kill people in European folklore and, as a consequence, in American folklore, are portrayed as enemies. They are bad. So sit with me on this. Werewolves are monsters. Werewolves were enemies in Supernatural. Someone watching Supernatural, at some point, really asked themselves, would a werewolf in wolf form have the same genitals as a wolf? This motherfucker actively wondered, would a werewolf's penis in human form have wolf-like characteristics? Would it have a knot at the base? Would they come a lot when they nut? And someone thought about the two lead actors fucking, which is the least weird part of this. They thought about alphas at the head of wolf packs, and how canid mates are called bitches, and we got the original kink writing prompt. A world with two types of men. The alpha male and the bitch male. Omegaverse is dumb. Giving people dog dicks, or giving people's dicks dog-like features, is dumb. Writers created a universe in which they could take on pre-existing notions of gender, sex, and sexuality from angles they don't experience, and criticize complex hierarchies from positions they don't stand in, because someone wanted one actor to have a wolf cock and another to get railed by a wolf cock. You see how stupid that sounds, right? I don't care if it's stupid. Really, I don't. I swear. Fiction is, in concept, a little stupid. But I care about stupid fiction, and I care about how history and stories and legends build our understandings in the world, and how our understandings are reflected in fiction, and how fiction builds our understandings of the world. Even if you and I don't give a shit about Omegaverse or how Omegaverse is stupid, because we don't give a shit about Omegaverse or how Omegaverse is stupid, we should give a shit about the endangered animals and decimated indigenous populations that died to someday give us humans with wolf cocks as an object of sexual interest. Wow! That's stupid. That's really fucking stupid. Boy, that sure is something. If everything up until now has been as miserable for you as it has been for me, I congratulate you on your wherewithal. For now, we can finally get to the thesis for realsies this time. Yes, I promise. Seriously. The thesis. Omegaverse is a literary tool for recontextualizing narratives without replacing originals or itself being redundant. Its stories are uniquely equipped to portray creator understandings of the world as we know it, the world as we don't, and the world as a what if. Even though the term boys love commonly refers to East Asian countries, East Asia isn't the only region producing or consuming material that counts as BL. Focusing on the three largest BL producers in one region for this project made the most sense. It's where the majority of my BL comic reading experience comes from, and that's where the majority of the existing BL research is. Thailand has an absolutely burgeoning BL scene that's known internationally. The Philippines is smaller but dedicated, and I've even read at least one Philippines Omegaverse comic called The Black Keys. Indonesia's is hard to find outside of Indonesia, but it exists, and it's very important to the people in Indonesia. But also, those are Southeast Asia, not East Asia. I don't make the rules or make up the regions, I'm just going by what Wikipedia told me. So when you and I are both ready to continue, I'm never ready for this. We will begin with Chinese Omegaverse manhwa, its signifiers, and its uniquely Chinese aspects.